The steel doors of the Chelyabinsk tractor factory swung open, and for the first time, German military officers stood face to face with the industrial reality that had defeated them. Row after row of assembly lines stretched into the distance, each one churning out T-34 tanks with mechanical precision. The rhythmic hammering of metal on metal echoed through the cavernous space, a sound that had haunted the Wehrmacht for 4 years. As these officers walked through what the Soviets called Tankograd, many experienced a moment of profound realization. The war hadn't been lost on the battlefields of Kursk, Stalingrad, or Moscow. It had been lost here, in the industrial heartland of the Soviet Union, where an unprecedented manufacturing miracle had turned the tide of history. Before we continue this remarkable story, I'd like to ask you to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring these important historical stories to light, and your comments fuel our research for future episodes. The story begins not in the factories of the Urals, but on a dusty road in western Russia in June 1941. Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, had been underway for mere days when German forces encountered something that would fundamentally challenge their assumptions about Soviet military technology. A panzer crew reported being engaged by an unknown Soviet tank that their guns couldn't penetrate. The report was initially dismissed as combat confusion or exaggeration. German intelligence had assured the Wehrmacht that Soviet armor technology lagged years behind their own. By late June 1941, a captured T-34 arrived at the Kummersdorf testing facility outside Berlin. What German engineers discovered when they examined this tank shook the foundations of their confidence. The T-34 featured sloped armor that effectively doubled its protection compared to flat plates of the same thickness. Its wide tracks distributed weight so efficiently that it could traverse terrain where German panzers became hopelessly bogged down. The diesel engine, something German tanks lacked entirely, provided remarkable range and reduced fire risk. Most disturbing of all, the 76 2mm main gun could penetrate any German tank. Then, in service from distances that made return fire impossible. Fritz Nallinger, chief engineer at Daimler-Benz, convened emergency meetings where engineers openly discussed something previously unthinkable: copying Soviet design features. Internal company correspondence reveals near panic, with one memo stating that Germany was at least 2 years behind Soviet tank development, possibly more. The company had just received contracts for expanded Panzer III production when the T-34 rendered their entire product line obsolete overnight. General Heinz Guderian, perhaps Germany's foremost tank warfare expert, witnessed the T-34's capabilities firsthand during the Battle of Mentsensk in October 1941. His 4th Panzer Division suffered a severe setback when Soviet T-34s destroyed numerous German tanks while remaining immune to return fire. Guderian immediately demanded an inquiry into the realities of tank warfare on the Eastern Front. By November 1941, he was suggesting to senior German tank designers and manufacturers that the quickest solution might be to produce a direct copy of the Soviet T-34. But here's where the story takes an even more remarkable turn. The T-34 that so impressed and terrified German engineers represented just the beginning of Soviet industrial capability. What the Germans didn't yet understand was that the Soviet Union was in the midst of the largest industrial relocation in human history. When German forces invaded in June 1941, Soviet leadership faced an existential crisis. The industrial heartland of European Russia, containing the majority of Soviet manufacturing capacity, lay directly in the path of the Wehrmacht advance. Stalin and the State Defense Committee made a decision that seemed impossible. They would move entire factories, along with their workers, machinery, and raw materials, over 1,000 miles east to the Ural Mountains and beyond. The scale of this evacuation defies imagination. Over 1,300 factories were dismantled, loaded onto rail cars, and transported eastward. More than 12 million people relocated with these enterprises. Factory equipment was often installed in the open air, with production beginning before buildings were even constructed to house it. Workers labored in temperatures that dropped to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, assembling tanks while snow fell on the machinery. The city of Chelyabinsk in the Urals became the center of this industrial transformation. The Chelyabinsk tractor plant, previously a manufacturer of agricultural equipment, was merged with evacuated tank factories from Leningrad and Kharkov. This combined facility became known as Tankograd, and it would become the single most important tank production center in human history. In the summer of 1942, when German forces were pushing toward the Volga and the Caucasus oil fields, Chelyabinsk received what seemed like an impossible order: begin mass production of T-34 tanks within 1 month. Industrial experts declared it technically impossible to retool an entire plant for a completely different product in such a time frame during wartime conditions. The workers of Tankograd accomplished it in 33 days. What happened next represented an industrial achievement that would determine the outcome of the war. By March 1942, Chelyabinsk was producing 500 T-34 tanks per month. The Stalingrad tractor factory, despite being under constant aerial bombardment and with German forces literally at the factory gates, continued producing tanks that drove directly from the assembly line to the battlefield. When Stalingrad's production finally stopped in August 1942 as German tanks reached the Volga, Chelyabinsk and other relocated factories had already filled the gap. The Soviets had accomplished something the Germans believed impossible. They had sustained and even expanded war production while simultaneously fighting a desperate defensive war. German intelligence had predicted that the loss of European Russian industry would cripple Soviet manufacturing capability. Instead, Soviet production increased. The numbers tell a story that German planners found incomprehensible. In 1941, the Soviet Union produced approximately 3,000 T-34 tanks, despite the catastrophic disruptions of invasion and relocation. In 1942, production jumped to over 12,600. By 1943, monthly production reached 1,300 tanks, the equivalent of 3 full-strength tank divisions every single month. German tank production, by contrast, never approached these numbers despite Germany's larger industrial base and lack of invasion disruption. The Panther tank, Germany's answer to the T-34, required over 150,000 man-hours to produce. The Tiger tank required 250,000 man-hours. The T-34 was being produced in 3,700 man-hours by 1943. A captured German report stated bluntly that Soviet factories could produce 2 T-34s for every Panzer Germany built. But this wasn't simply about quantity over quality. The Soviets had made a strategic decision that German planners, trapped in their assumptions about technological sophistication, couldn't comprehend. When Operation Barbarossa began, Soviet designers had been working on improvements to the T-34. Stalin personally ordered all development work frozen. Every factory was to produce the existing T-34 design without modification until the military situation stabilized. No improvements, no upgrades, no variations. Just production, massive and unceasing. This decision flew in the face of German military doctrine, which emphasized technological superiority and constant refinement. German tanks grew more complex and capable as the war progressed, but they also became more difficult and time-consuming to produce. The Panther and Tiger were formidable machines, perhaps the finest tanks of the war from a purely technical standpoint. But they arrived in numbers that could never match Soviet production. Consider the mathematics of attrition. A German panzer division might destroy 2 or 3 times its number of Soviet tanks in an engagement and still lose the strategic exchange. the Soviets could replace their losses within weeks. German tank losses took months to replenish, if they could be replaced at all. By 1943, German panzer forces often found themselves fighting Soviet tank armies several times their own size. The industrial disparity extended beyond just tank production. The Soviets produced more than 800,000 field guns and mortars during the war, compared to Germany's 318,000. Soviet factories turned out 130,000 aircraft. The monthly shell production reached 10 million rounds. Germany, with its supposedly superior industrial capacity, couldn't match these figures despite facing fewer disruptions to its manufacturing base. How had the Germans miscalculated so catastrophically? The answer lies in a combination of ideological blindness, intelligence failures, and fundamental misunderstanding of Soviet society and capabilities. German intelligence before the invasion had concluded that the Soviet Union was industrially backward, its population demoralized, and its government brittle. The purges of the late 1930s had eliminated much of the Soviet military leadership and industrial management. German planners expected the Soviet state to collapse within weeks of invasion, long before industrial capacity could become relevant. They were catastrophically wrong on every count. Soviet society, despite its brutal internal repressions, proved remarkably resilient when faced with external threat. The Soviet government, rather than collapsing, demonstrated extraordinary organizational capability in relocating and expanding war production. The Soviet worker, whose motivation German planners had dismissed, worked 16-hour shifts in unheated factories to produce the weapons that would drive the Wehrmacht back to Berlin. I want to take a moment to thank those of you watching and encourage you to leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this incredible industrial achievement. What aspects of this story surprise you most? Your engagement helps the algorithm share these historical stories with more people. The German response to the T-34 crisis illustrates their industrial limitations. In November 1941, shortly after Guderian's encounter with T-34s at Mtsensk, a special commission was formed including representatives of the Army Ordnance Office, the Armaments Ministry, and tank designers and manufacturers. They traveled to the front to examine captured T-34s and determine Germany's response. The commission's findings were sobering. Germany lacked the industrial capacity to mass-produce the T-34's aluminum diesel engine. Shortages of raw materials made it difficult to replicate the Soviet steel alloys. Instead of adapting Soviet manufacturing efficiency, German industry decided to concentrate on producing the Tiger tank already in limited production and designing the new Panther tank. This decision, while producing excellent tanks, sealed Germany's fate in the quantitative battle. The Tiger tank was a masterpiece of engineering, nearly invincible in combat when properly supported. Germany produced approximately 1,400 Tigers during the entire war. The Panther, entering service in 1943, was perhaps the best medium tank of the conflict. Germany produced about 6,000 Panthers. The Soviet Union produced over 84,000 T-34s of all variants. The consequences played out across every major engagement on the Eastern Front. At Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, Germany committed its finest panzer divisions equipped with the new Panthers and Tigers. Soviet forces, with numerical superiority built on their production advantage, absorbed horrific losses but held the line. The Germans never again attempted a strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. By 1944, the disparity had become crushing. Soviet tank armies, each containing hundreds of T-34s, rolled westward in offensives that German forces could slow but not stop. German tank units fought desperately, often achieving impressive tactical results, but strategic defeat was inevitable. For every German panzer destroyed, Soviet factories produced several replacements. German tank losses, by contrast, became increasingly difficult to replace as Allied bombing disrupted production and raw material shortages intensified. The story of Tankograd and the other relocated factories represents more than just industrial statistics. It represents the triumph of organizational will and human endurance over supposedly superior technology and efficiency. German engineering produced better individual tanks. Soviet organization produced more tanks, faster, under worse conditions. Consider the Uralmash factory, which began T-34 production in September 1942. The first 5 tanks were delivered on September 21st, the very next day, leaving the factory workshops for the Red Army. By November 1942, the facility was producing 101 tanks. This acceleration occurred while the factory was simultaneously producing other military equipment and training workers with no prior tank-building experience. The human cost of this achievement remains staggering. Soviet workers labored under conditions that would be considered unacceptable in any modern industrial setting. 12 to 16-hour shifts were standard. Food was rationed to the point of malnutrition. Housing was overcrowded and inadequate. Industrial accidents were common, and medical care was limited. The Soviet government mobilized its population for total war in ways that the German war economy, at least until 1943, never attempted. Yet this system produced results. Soviet factories achieved 98% of maximum capacity by 1942, increasing from just 32% in 1941. German industry, despite having greater potential capacity, didn't reach 50% of peak capacity until 1943. The conclusion is unavoidable. The Soviet Union outproduced Germany, starting in 1941, despite having a smaller industrial sector and facing invasion. This brings us back to those German officers walking through Tankograd after the war. Whether this occurred during prisoner of war detainment or in the immediate post-war period, the impact was profound. German military professionals, trained to believe in technological and organizational superiority, confronted the physical reality of Soviet industrial might. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, captured at Stalingrad in February 1943, spent years in Soviet custody. As one of the planners of Operation Barbarossa, his understanding of pre-war assumptions about Soviet capabilities was intimate. His post-capture experiences, including collaboration with Soviet authorities and testimony at Nuremberg, suggest a fundamental reassessment of why Germany lost the war. Other German officers had similar experiences. Those taken prisoner during the war and held in Soviet camps were often employed in reconstruction efforts, giving them first-hand exposure to Soviet industrial organization. Some were shown factories and production facilities as part of propaganda efforts or simply as part of their work assignments. The contrast between their expectations and reality was stark. What they witnessed contradicted everything German pre-war planning had assumed. The Soviet Union wasn't industrially primitive. Its factories weren't less capable. Soviet workers weren't less motivated. Soviet organization wasn't inferior. In the specific context of total war mobilization, the Soviet system had proven more effective than Germany's. The T-34 tank itself became a symbol of this larger truth. Yes, it was a well-designed tank with excellent mobility, good armor, and adequate firepower, but its real genius lay in its manufacturability. Soviet engineers had designed a tank that could be produced quickly, in large numbers, by semi-skilled workers using available materials. It could be repaired in field conditions with basic tools. Its diesel engine ran on fuel that was less refined than the gasoline German tanks required. Its wide tracks performed well in mud, snow, and sand without complex suspension systems. German tanks, by contrast, grew increasingly sophisticated and complex. The Tiger II, entering service in 1944, weighed 70 tons, required precision manufacturing, used expensive materials, broke down frequently, and consumed fuel at rates that Germany's dwindling supplies couldn't support. It was arguably the most powerful tank of the war. Germany produced fewer than 500 of them. They had minimal strategic impact. The lesson extended beyond tank production to the entire conduct of the war. Germany fought World War II like a traditional European conflict, expecting decisive battles and relatively short campaigns. The Soviet Union fought a war of national survival, mobilizing every resource and accepting losses that would have broken other nations. German production gradually increased as the war progressed, finally reaching something approaching total war mobilization in 1944 when the outcome was already decided. Soviet production peaked in 1943, having achieved near total mobilization by 1942. Logistics compounded Germany's problems. The Panther and Tiger tanks were mechanically complex and prone to breakdown. They required specialized spare parts, trained mechanics, and substantial maintenance time. Soviet tanks broke down too, but they were designed for rapid field repair or replacement. A damaged T-34 might be cannibalized for parts to keep others running, or simply abandoned and replaced with a new tank from the production line. The Soviet approach wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Tank crews knew their vehicles were less sophisticated than German panzers. They knew they would likely face tanks that were better armed and better armored. They also knew that for every Soviet tank lost, several more would arrive as replacements, while German losses were increasingly irreplaceable. By 1945, the strategic situation had become absurd from a German perspective. Panzer divisions fought desperately to hold back Soviet offensives, achieving local victories that meant nothing in the larger context. A German company might eliminate an entire Soviet tank battalion and consider it a success, only to face a fresh tank brigade the next day. The mathematics of attrition, powered by Soviet production superiority, made German defeat inevitable. The total production figures tell the final story. The Soviet Union produced approximately 84,000 T-34 tanks of all variants during the war. Including other tank types and self-propelled guns, Soviet factories produced over 100,000 armored fighting vehicles. Germany produced approximately 27,000 tanks and 27,000 assault guns and tank destroyers. The Soviets outproduced Germany by a margin of nearly 2-to-1 in armor, while simultaneously producing more aircraft, artillery, and ammunition. These numbers represented not just industrial capacity, but strategic choice. Germany could have mobilized its economy earlier and more completely. It chose not to, partly due to ideological factors about women's roles in society, partly due to political considerations about maintaining civilian morale, and partly due to fundamental misunderstanding of the type of war they were fighting. By the time Germany achieved full war mobilization in 1944, the Soviet Union had been operating at maximum capacity for 2 years. The story of German officers witnessing Soviet T-34 production represents a moment of truth. All the pre-war assumptions, all the racial ideologies about Slavic inferiority, all the confidence in German technical superiority collided with industrial reality. The Soviet Union had built more tanks, faster, under worse conditions, with less advanced industrial infrastructure than Germany possessed. They had done so while fighting a devastating war on their own territory, while relocating entire industries thousands of miles, while suffering losses that would have destroyed other nations. This wasn't just about tanks. It was about fundamentally different approaches to industrial warfare. Germany entered World War II thinking it could win through technological superiority and tactical brilliance. The Soviet Union understood that modern industrial warfare was about production capacity, resource mobilization, and the ability to absorb and replace losses. In this contest, the T-34 assembly lines of Tankograd proved more decisive than all of Germany's technical innovations. The irony wasn't lost on those German officers. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Germany had helped the Soviet Union establish its tank industry, setting up production facilities and training programs as part of secret cooperation to evade Versailles Treaty restrictions. German technical assistance had helped create the industrial base that would later outproduce Germany itself. The Kharkov locomotive factory, one of the original T-34 production facilities, had been established with German help. German experts had trained Soviet engineers who would later design and produce the tanks that defeated the Wehrmacht. The T-34 production facilities that German officers witnessed after the war represented the culmination of Soviet industrial development. Tankograd alone had produced tens of thousands of tanks. The facility continued operating after the war, transitioning back to civilian production, but maintaining the capability that had proven so decisive. Walking through those assembly lines, seeing the efficiency of Soviet production methods, understanding the scale of output that had been sustained for 4 years, German military professionals finally grasped the magnitude of their defeat. It wasn't that German tanks were inferior, though the early war models certainly were. By 1943, German tanks were arguably superior in most technical categories. It wasn't that German tactics were flawed, though strategic errors certainly occurred. German tactical skill remained high throughout the war. The defeat came down to something more fundamental. Germany couldn't produce enough tanks to sustain the war it had chosen to fight. Before we conclude, I want to encourage you one more time to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We're committed to bringing you detailed, well-researched historical content, and your support makes that possible. Leave a comment about what you'd like to see next. The lesson of the T-34 and Soviet tank production extends beyond World War II. It demonstrates that in industrial warfare, manufacturing capacity can be more important than individual unit quality. It shows that strategic choices about production and mobilization can outweigh tactical excellence. It proves that assumptions about enemy capabilities, especially when rooted in ideology rather than rigorous intelligence analysis, can lead to catastrophic miscalculation. For those German officers walking through Tankograd, seeing the vast factory floors, the efficient assembly processes, the stockpiles of completed tanks, understanding finally dawned. The war had been lost before it truly began. Not because German soldiers weren't brave or skilled, not because German equipment wasn't capable, but because Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of industrial warfare in the 20th century. The Soviet Union, despite its agricultural economy, despite Stalin's purges, despite the catastrophic losses of 1941, had mobilized its industrial capacity more effectively than Germany. It had made hard choices about production versus perfection. It had sacrificed sophistication for quantity. It had created systems that could sustain massive losses and continue functioning. Most importantly, it had understood that in total war, the factory floor is as important as the battlefield. The T-34, that tank which had shocked German forces in June 1941, represented all of these choices. It wasn't the best tank of World War II from a purely technical standpoint, but it was produced in numbers that made it the most important tank of the war. Its production represented an industrial achievement that Germany, for all its vaunted efficiency and technical skill, could not match. Those assembly lines at Tankograd, churning out tank after tank, shift after shift, year after year, represented something that German pre-war planning had deemed impossible. They represented the defeat of ideology by industrial reality. They represented the triumph of quantity, properly organized and sustained, over quality that couldn't be produced in sufficient numbers. As those German officers left Tankograd, they carried with them a truth that would reshape military thinking for generations. The next war, whatever form it took, would be won not just on battlefields but in factories. Industrial capacity, properly mobilized and sustained, could overcome tactical excellence and technological superiority. The T-34 assembly lines had proven it beyond any doubt. The story of German generals witnessing Soviet T-34 production isn't just about a moment of realization. It's about the larger arc of World War II on the Eastern Front. It's about how the Soviet Union, written off by German planners as industrially backward and militarily incompetent, outfought and outproduced the Wehrmacht. It's about how assumptions, especially comforting ones about enemy inferiority, can lead to strategic disaster. In the end, the war wasn't lost in the streets of Stalingrad or the fields of Kursk. It was lost in the factories of the Urals, where Soviet workers built the tanks that would drive all the way to Berlin. The T-34 production lines of Tankograd represent one of the decisive factors of World War II, a reality that German officers could only fully appreciate when they witnessed it firsthand. By then, of course, it was far too late.